Hey everyone, this is Sociology of Poverty, Lecture 3.1. In this one, we're going to be talking about is it even possible to fix poverty? And we're going to start to talk about some of the ways that people have tried to fix poverty. So, we will address what are the demographics of poor people. We're going to look at poverty over the life course and what exactly that means. We'll talk about resources for people in poverty, and then we'll also talk about poverty in other countries. In terms of content warnings, there are some insensitive and offensive depictions of poor people, namely to show you how society presents poor people. So, who is poor is a question surrounded by many misconceptions. We often don't even ask the question, we just make assumptions, right? Think of a poor person, and most of us would probably think of about 10 to 15 of the same characteristics. We think of poor people as having no money whatsoever. We think of poor people as being so-called welfare queens or people that just draw money from the government and then waste it. There was an especially interesting, helpful depiction of a stereotype of a welfare queen on a Netflix series called Glow that came out a few years ago. In our lower left-hand corner, we have I don't blame this kid. His parents decided to dress him up like a homeless person, basically for Halloween, and that's just so not cool. But before we go further, we want to touch on a pretty key social scientific concept. You probably already know this. When we're talking about macro level things, we're talking about big multinational corporation type stuff, things in society that operate on the big scale. When we talk about micro level things, we're talking about small scales in society. So you could be talking about your family, the hall in your apartment building, people on the street, etc. Many of our misconceptions about the poor are also tied to race. And this is a common and often subconscious misconception about Black people, Latinx people, and other underprivileged minority groups. This assumption is obviously false upon reflection, but unfortunately, some of these things have components of truth to them. Basically, it often happens that the ugliness is elevated, the ugliness is highlighted, while deleting the hard truths of the reality that many people face. So, the greatest number of poor people are actually white. So we see here the U.S. population by race laid out there. Statistically, that also in the United States, the greatest number of people are white. And that, however, the higher percentage of Black and Latinx populations are poor when compared to the white population. Let's lay all that out there for a little bit. So, if we take this chart in the year 2025, we expect there will be about 65% of the American population, which, if I remember correctly, is somewhere in the zone of 500 million. I'm probably off by a couple hundred million there, but let's just say 500 million. If 60% of that 500 million, if that 60%, and then 11% of that 60% are poor people, so we're talking poor white people, that will be greater than that looks like maybe 15% of Black people on the 2025 gauge right there. So if that 35% of the 15% of Black people are poor, then there are still, according to this lower chart, far more poor white people than there are poor black people. A better way to say all of this is that black people, American Indians, Hispanic people are disproportionately poor when compared to the white population, or you could also say the general population, and that would be still accurate. The key word is disproportionately. This indicates structural racism in our society. Let's define that thing, because it's a definition that often isn't given. Structural racism is racism that is embedded in our society on the macro level. And we will come back to that over and over again because it's something that our society has a hard time dealing with. For example, for generations, it was illegal for black people to own property in the same way as white people, and for much of that time, black people were even considered property. That's what slavery was. Thus, white people's families during the era of slavery built and accrued intergenerational wealth, while those black families did not, because they were being held in captivity. So that kind of intergenerational wealth can last a very, very, very long time, especially during the time of tremendous growth in the early American economy. You can look at, for example, the descendants today of former super millionaires like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. All of these people, their great-great-great-grandchildren are today hyper wealthy. It's not because those people earned their own fortunes, it's because of the massive numbers that were those fortunes. And these families do not have black counterparts. There simply is almost no representation of black people or Latinx people and many other minorities among the hyper wealthy, at least not at the time of this recording. So, we talked a little bit about race there. Let's talk about rural versus urban. I've dedicated a pretty substantial portion of this course to rural poverty. That's because we often think of poverty as being a largely urban phenomena, and urban poverty is absolutely very, very real. We look at places like New York City, we look at Detroit, we look at Youngstown, we look at Los Angeles. You could look at many international cities, including Mumbai. Brasilia is also a massive city that has very, very large poor slums. But rural poverty does also exist, and that's kind of why I emphasize it. It is true that the cost of living is more expensive in cities, but opportunities for jobs and social services are also greater in cities. So while cities are more expensive, you have maybe not a good chance, but a better chance of being able to find a job. Now, given a lot of those jobs also don't pay very well. So who is poor is well, I already said that. If we look at Appalachia, the natively said Appalachia, that always trips me up because I grew up in northern Appalachia and we said it Appalachia, but in the southern portions, most of them do say Appalachia. This is pretty much the poorest area, the most disproportionately poor area in the United States. You see what this map shows is that those green areas have incomes of under $23,000. And $23,000 is at the lower end of working class. You note where those kind of tannish, yellowish spots are. Those are in highly rural areas. What folklorists would call, I believe they call it the Greater Appalachian Cultural Region. So basically where Appalachia is its most culturally concentrated. And that's exactly where the bulk of those very, very poor areas are. Poverty in Appalachia is overwhelmingly persistent. During the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, poor Scottish immigrants moved to the region. That actually explains a lot of traditions surrounding moonshine in the Appalachia region, is that effectively moonshine is whiskey that has not been basically been processed through barrels, through wooden barrels. That's what makes whiskey kind of brownish. Well, those Scottish miners brought the whiskey traditions over into the Appalachians and the Appalachian Mountains, whatever. And then that kind of created that culture. Anyway, back to the topic. Oppression of the Scots in the UK was incredibly bad, incredibly bad. And all immigration waves, especially the United States, are done in an attempt to make lives better, right? So those people got coal mining jobs because they knew how to do those coal mining jobs. And we see that with almost all immigration routes. Considering the natural resources that were and continue to be in Appalachia, there should be multiple industrial hubs in that area. So if you consider how big cities grow, especially if you're the kind of person who has played like city builder video games, right? You know that you need to locate a city near where there are resources. And the resources are so abundant in Appalachia that there really should be probably at least 2 mega cities in that area. Yes, Pittsburgh is to the far north. Yes, there are smaller cities like Knoxville in Appalachia, but we're talking about like a Los Angeles, a New York, a Chicago size city should be there based on the resources that are there, and they simply aren't. The reason for that being is that the industrialists of the 1800s, those people who are sometimes called robber barons, decided that instead of creating livable cities near where extraction occurred, they would pool most of those financial resources to build their economic kingdoms, if you were, in the cities that they were in. So, and a lot of that was pulled along by building what were called company towns, where the settlements were such that the workers there had to live on very meager earnings to be able to even try to survive. People were kept intentionally not getting their share of the wealth that they were created. But that is a very old story, not only in the United States, but a lot of places. If you can think about it this way, in maybe more modern terms, it's the exact opposite of the buy local principle, right? If maybe your local community is really big and buy local, that means you buy things that were made in your local area to try to help people economically, right? The phenomena is also called internal colonialism. So effectively, the Appalachian region is a colony of the greater United States, wherein we pull the resources out of that area and we redistribute the wealth to basically where the rich and powerful people are. So this is a new topic. We tend to think of being poor as a permanent condition, right? It's even how we say it. I am poor, and that's implied. I am poor forever. I will always be poor. I grew up poor, whatever. The reality of the matter is that less than 15% of people who experience poverty are poor for longer than 5 years, and then 53% of people who experience poverty are poor for less than 1 year. So most people who, and this is why the term is better said, experience poverty, it is a temporary misfortune, if you will. Now let's talk a little bit more about poverty over the life course, your chances of being poor during your life. So, life course is a sociology and especially a demographic concept. Demography is basically the study of statistics. The lifespan of an individual is basically their life course. By studying how factors such as poverty impact individuals over their life course, we can learn how those factors compound over a lifetime. So here's an example of life course studies. We can see age of men and women, and it's often pointed out that women have much longer life expectancies than men, and generally that is true if you look at the raw numbers. However, you will notice that if you live over 70 and certainly over 75, then people will men and women have similar life courses, life expectancies. That is namely because men do stupid things during their lifetimes that get them killed. If you were to blow this out and focus in on the teens, 20s, and 30s, you actually see a massive jump in the late teens to early 20s of male fatalities. That's because during that period in time, we men tend to do exceedingly stupid things that are quite dangerous. That's just one example of kind of the things that demographers study. So longitudinal analysis then is the study of an individual or group over a prolonged period of time. And typically we're talking about a time of like 20 years or more. It's a very, very long range tool. And unfortunately, as society changes, then that could potentially change your study. If, say, there's a massive crash in the stock market, or maybe there's a war in the country, or whatever, that sometimes needs to be taken into account. All of this is to say that longitudinal analysis of studying a group of people over a very long period of time is very difficult, but it is also incredibly useful in understanding poverty. So we have attempted to fix poverty in the United States on multiple occasions. The most recent of those attempts, and recent is a relative term here, occurred in the 1960s when President Lyndon B. Johnson attempted to, quote, eliminate poverty. And he called this the Great Society. The goal was to relieve, cure, and prevent poverty through government measures. Johnson's initiatives greatly expanded programs that are now commonly classified as so-called welfare. Welfare is a general term that we use for government assistance. And it should be pointed out that when I say welfare, it has a negative connotation. But prior to the political climate of the mid-1990s, the word welfare didn't have that negative stigma to it. That's because there was a conservative social movement and a very specific move by Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, who is that man wearing a red tie toward the center of these pictures with a big head of grayish hair, and it's not Bill Clinton. Newt Gingrich very specifically worked out kind of a political campaign to make welfare a dirty word, right? If you look back at organizations that are have a vested interest in helping people out, many of those organizations prior to the end of the 80s had what were called welfare programs. And all those programs meant were helping people in our community. It didn't have anything to do with basically lazy people taking things from the government. The War on Poverty created and expanded many programs. So you might know some of these. Head Start is one of them, and Head Start is a relatively popular program. Vista, which is another thing I'll talk about in a moment. TANF was also created at this time. What we commonly call food stamps were created at this time, as was WIC and other programs. And before I get to those specific things, I do have an interesting note on how language changes over time. This actually just lays out the whole welfare thing I just explained, and how welfare programs provided basic health care. Basically, what I'm talking about now is that when we talked about the welfare of the community, we used those terms before. Now it is often used as kind of an insulting term. So the first of these programs is Head Start. Head Start is a child care and education program that is designed to prepare children for kindergarten. One of its major factors is that it educates children and allows parents to go to work, and that is really very, very helpful. Reminder, we talked about this previously, that childcare is an absolutely major expense for parents with children under the age of 5. I don't like to think about how many thousands of dollars I spent on preschool for my kids. And I know very well that my kids are privileged to have had that education before kindergarten. And a lot of kids don't have that. Additionally, then, not only do they go to preschool less, but kids from underprivileged backgrounds often have lower levels of literacy because their parents themselves have lower levels of literacy. And by perpetuating kind of those insufficiencies in education, it really goes a long way for perpetuating poverty. Head Start revolutionized pre-K education. It inspired many educational programs designed to close what we call the achievement gap. Programs typically exist on a sliding scale, and they are based on the income of parents. So if you are better off, and there's a Head Start program in your area, you can absolutely put your kids in Head Start too, and that kind of thing's very good for getting kids to interact with people that might be a little bit different from themselves. From a early childhood education standpoint, that's super, super good. And longitudinal studies have shown a dramatic advantage for children who have received comprehensive pre-K education. So I expect my kids to have a bit of an advantage because of their preschool education. And then through Head Start, many kids whose parents can't afford that same education are able to also enjoy that kind of advantage. And in some areas, there are movements to make pre-K education more universal. Just like when I was very young, there was a movement to make kindergarten universal. While it really, prior to the mid-80s, wasn't universal kindergarten was not common. A lot of kids started in first grade. What's called Vista, or sometimes AmeriCorps Vista, or sometimes it's just called AmeriCorps. This is a domestic version of the Peace Corps that is designed to build infrastructure and assistance programs to help poor people. This helps in a variety of projects. Currently, this slide's a little bit old, during the height of the pandemic, AmeriCorps Vista people were being used to distribute vaccines when we needed that, basically those extra hands, right? That this is all to say that when there are big problems in communities, the vistas, as they're called, the vistas are sent in basically to give those extra hands. AmeriCorps Vista serves all 50 states and all U.S. territories, and it's a really great starting position and looks good on a resume for people that are looking to go into social work or other community-oriented professions. If I would have known about AmeriCorps Vista when I left college, I very well may have signed up for it. There's a link you can use, or you can just Google search AmeriCorps Vista. To my understanding, they're present in most cities across the country. So, these things that we call food stamps, more commonly now called PEBT, or just EBT. EBT is money given to you by the government to buy food with. They're called food stamps because you see the picture at the top. They were originally handed out in a book of things that were basically looked like stamps. They were like little coupons. And then you would give those to the grocery store, and the grocery store would take that as money, and they were legally required to accept it as money. That was a big part of the legislation. Modern food stamps, though, however, look like debit or credit cards, just like the one below there. And these programs, though, can vary widely from state to state. While we're referencing the pandemic, during the pandemic, all children in Columbus City schools were given a certain amount of EBT dollars because that money wasn't being spent on food for kids in the schools. They had a lot of this extra money, so they basically just distributed it among the students. And that helped a lot of kids out when their parents might not necessarily have had work. These programs are often tied to free or reduced lunch programs in schools. So in other words, if a family qualifies for food stamps, children do typically qualify for free or reduced lunch programs. One program that I am especially proud of as somebody that lives in the city of Columbus, and there certainly are things that happen in Columbus that I'm not proud of, is the free lunch program in Columbus City. So if you go to Columbus City schools, all children are entitled to free lunch, and at most school buildings, free breakfast as well. This was done to lift the stigma associated with receiving free lunch and to help ease the financial burden for families. In addition, it increases the nutrition value of the food that children are eating by basically making more en masse. There were unforeseen side effects, however. All children from ages 0 to 18, I'll talk about the pandemic there, but I talked about that bit just a second ago. There's the written out version of it. TANF. TANF, it stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This is a very highly regulated government program that provides temporary income to needy families. And this thing is the one that was targeted by Mr. Gingrich as being, quote, welfare, the big, bad, shadowy welfare. And it is absolutely the most maligned of all welfare programs. Basically, what this does, it gives money to people who are out of work effectively so that they can continue living. There are certain political persuasions that don't think that should happen. The TANF program, which is time limited, assists families with children when the parents or other responsible relatives cannot for the family's basic needs. The federal government provides grants to states to run the TANF program, and these states are designed to accomplish 4 goals. What does that mean? Those words that I wrote? Basically, TANF is a federal program And exactly how it works varies from state to state, but each state must do these four things with their TANF program. They must provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for. They must attempt to end dependency of needy parents on government benefits by helping prepare them for job preparation and work and marriage. Note that somewhat problematic wording in there. That is because that number 2 bullet point was put in by people who had kind of this perpetual misconception of people on welfare being as somehow lazy, somehow attempting not to work. I am of the absolute philosophical belief that all people don't like to be lazy. It's boring to be lazy. Anyway, I have strong feelings on this topic. TANF needs to prevent and reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies and establish annual numerical goals for preventing instances of out-of-wedlock pregnancies. We very much see the morality and the moralizing of poor people in the mid-1990s. So these legislatures, a lot of which I'm sure had absolutely lousy marriages, were attempting to keep poor people from having kids without being married because that was their perception of poor people. I try to stay neutral, but this stuff just makes me so angry. And to encounter the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. So again, all of these things that the TANF programs must do, in addition to giving people money to live, they have to basically regulate their families. In the past, cases of welfare fraud have been highly sensationalized. The reality of the matter that this type of fraud is incredibly rare. Unfortunately, because it was so heavily sensationalized, and specifically the fraud committed by a woman named Linda Taylor, the so-called welfare queen of Chicago, which honestly, she probably had some mental health issues, and she's one of millions of people who were helped by TANF. This created a really very negative, very stigmatizing view of people that are helped out by the government and somehow portraying them as being criminals. WIC, then, is a much more politically neutral kind of program in these regards. It is specifically designed to help people who are in the moment of great need, as in, yes, there are absolutely gendered words here, people who are taking care of little babies, right? So women, infants, and children. Again, there is that 1980s mindset that women are the ones who take care of children and only women. You can get WIC money. Anyone can that is taking care of an infant. That's wrong if you qualify, right? So if you aren't that well off. Now, WIC, though, the threshold is pretty darn high. So even people who are working class and some people who are even middle class do qualify for WIC. My parents, who were mediumly well off when I was little, they qualified for WIC when I was a baby because they didn't have so much money, and I benefited from that. I don't remember it at all, but I did. And then heating and cooling assistance. This is another major program that these types of general welfare programs advocate for. Heating and cooling assistance is designed to help people pay their seasonal heating and cooling bills. So these programs vary from location to location, largely based on the climate of the region. So in Ohio, that means that it's primarily a heating program. In some place very north like Alaska or Maine or South Dakota, which is a very cold place, they would be heating programs. But in places like Texas, Georgia, New Mexico, they would tend to be cooling programs because it is just as dangerous for some people to get too hot as it is to get too cold. And this also is based on 200% poverty, because if people may be tempted not to pay their heating bill, then we want to absolutely be able to help them out with that. If you have any questions, as always, please send me an email, and good luck with this week's work.